good evening. How are you gentlemen doing?
Good.
Yeah, I just got a double espresso here. Keep myself alert during the live stream here.
Good. I got my hot cocoa.
Oh, that's pretty good stuff too.
Yeah,
I
soothes the throat.
Iced tea will have to do for me.
That's also nice. Um, is it American iced tea or is it the good kind?
Canadian.
Yeah, good. All right. So there's enough sugar to keep you awake.
No, this is the Nestle Zero.
Oh, zero. Okay.
Iced tea zero.
Yeah. All right. Well, before we get into this, Kirk, how's your packing going?
oh, I don't leave till tomorrow, so the packing hasn't. I haven't done anything yet.
That's the way to do it.
Yeah.
That's the way. That's when you find out, oh man, we're out of toothpaste. Oh well.
Yeah.
Go
Or
home.
I should have thrown my clothes in the laundry.
Yeah. Do you want to share what's going on?
Sure. I'm looking forward to giving a 12 seminars, Tuesday, 4 days, 12 seminars in 4 days, 1 hour each on current challenges to the Christian faith to a group of probably that range in age from about 17 to 22-year-olds. And it's going to be good because it's not just the seminars I'm giving. I'm hanging out with them the whole time so they can pick my brain for a week.
So 12 1-hour seminars over 4
Yeah.
days.
Yeah.
And there's no plan B on this, is there? Like,
Well,
you don't have like somebody waiting in the wings to like, oh, and your throat's starting to hurt or something. You don't have a spare. Like, how are you gonna come up there and read from your
well,
notes at the end?
what I did do is I sent all my keynotes ahead, and I said, "Here's in case the plane takes a nosedive, and I'm find myself at the Purdy gates ahead of schedule. Somebody there can hopefully go through my outlines." It would be interesting to watch. That's Plan B.
All right. Well, those could probably work as scripts later. Maybe we'll see some videos getting produced here over the next.
It'd be more like decoding practice. Let's say people want to do decryption.
Okay.
So they would work through it as a group. Let's decrypt this keynote presentation and see what the main points were.
Well, one time I was speaking at University of Saskatchewan, and my wife Phyllis got a serious problem with her gallbladder, and she's going to need surgery. And so I gave my notes to our good friend Rod Alm, and Rod gave the message.
That's
that
good.
night
Excellent.
when I flew home, and he did
anything from
fine.
your notes, or did he just do his own thing?
Actually, I wasn't there to verify this, but I believe he used my notes pretty well. Yeah, but he probably added a couple of his own stories, I would imagine.
Yeah. Slowed it down a little.
Yeah, Rod's a very good storyteller.
He is.
Awesome. All right. Well, today we're talking about some more bad things that Christians did. Michael, you were a big fan of my clickbait headline here. Witches. This is one of those things that everything I know about what you've been sharing over that last little bit was mostly what I learned from watching Monty Python. So this is another one of those things that all I can think about is Monty Python when I'm hearing this stuff. But fascinating. Just reading the little talking points that you sent earlier was like, okay, this is going to be a fun one. So why don't you lead it off, Michael? I know this is a little bit of a rabbit trail that you ended up on that you weren't expecting.
It just expanded. I open sort of one door and enter a room, and there's 4 more doors I need to look at. It's much more complicated an issue than I anticipated it was going to be, and some of the scholars that I have been quoting recently didn't even touch it. Only one of them actually touched it at all. and only a little bit. And it's because it is quite complicated. And we're kind of laughing and joking here, and I think, oh gosh, we really shouldn't be smiling about burning people at the stake. I mean, that thought is just repulsive to me. I mean, how could other people do this to other people? And as with all these other issues that have come up, I do often have to think, now, what would I have done in that time, in that situation? And if you put yourself in other people's shoes, sometimes you might not do what you think you would have done. So Kirk put me onto a quote from C.S. Lewis last week from Mere Christianity that applies to this idea of putting ourselves in other people's shoes. So Lewis says, 300 years ago, people in England were putting witches to death. But surely the reason we do not execute witches now is that we do not believe there are such things. If we did, if we really thought that there were people going about who had sold themselves to the devil and received supernatural powers from him in return, and were using these powers to kill their neighbors or drive them mad or bring bad weather and all the calamities that go with that, surely we'd all agree that if anyone deserved the death penalty, then these filthy quislings did. And I think that's a good point. We just don't think there are such things as witches. But if you were brought up in a culture where that was not doubted, not in question, that might change. Although even that point isn't as straightforward as you might think. So before I get into this complicated mess, I want to deal sort of upfront with the exaggeration issues again, which have been a part of all the other topics that we've talked about. And the claims that have been made here are exaggerated. And Rodney Stark, the sociologist of history of sociology, says the following: perhaps no historical statistics have been so outrageously inflated as the numbers executed as witches during the craze that took place in Europe from about 1450 to 1700. Many writers have placed the final death toll at 9 million. 9 to 10, actually, I've read it. And they, compare it with the Holocaust. And it's widely claimed, and while it is acknowledged that Protestants burned a lot of witches too, historians have stressed the leading role played by the Inquisition, that is, older historians have. It is widely claimed that the witch hunts ended only when the so-called Dark Ages of religious extremism were overthrown by the supposed Enlightenment. That's Stark's phrase. And Stark ends this paragraph saying, vicious nonsense, all of it. So the whole thing is nonsense. So let's just look at the numbers, and this is going to be just a survey off the top before we get into the history of them and the causes of them and how we should approach it. Let's start off with the easy one, and that's the Salem witch trials that took place in Salem, Massachusetts, in America. Now, here we have people with probably the right heart attitude, but reasoning horribly and making terrible mistakes in judgment. So between June and September of 1692, there were 6 men and 14 women who were eventually convicted and executed. 19 by hanging, by the way, nobody was burned at the stake in the United States, because English law called for the death penalty for witchcraft, and hanging was the most common. There were 150 others plus who were imprisoned, but the whole thing finally ended in September 1692. So it's June to September was the trials. And in September it ended when the governor, William Phipps, dissolved the court and said, enough of this insanity. And the colony's leading minister ended the witch hunt, and those that remained in prison were released. And the judge that was presiding over the trials confessed his guilt in the way he handled the whole thing about 5 years later. And in 1711, the colony's legislatures made reparations to the heirs of the victims, and they annulled the convictions.
So what happened here, Michael? Like, what drove that? When you see people suddenly wake up and become sane again, um, they look back and they said, "Here's what happened, or here's what we did, or here's." So what was the problem?
Well, we were in a different context where people did believe in witches. And it looks like in this case, it was mostly the accusations of children that were believed by
Wow.
adults. But it's still mind boggling. It's still mind boggling. Just mistake after mistake. Um, there were problems with relatives of the accusers being on the in the juries. Um, and there were just so many things. Once we get into the causes, we're going to see it is really hard to nail down. In fact, the only one thing that historians are agreed upon is that there's not just one thing that caused
Mhm.
the witch crazes in the different places. But in this case, it was the accusations of children that were taken very seriously. And there's theological misapplication. Um, and it only lasted a year, 1 year witch hunt. 16 people prior to that time had been hung for witchcraft in New England. And then in that 1692 time period, 20 were executed. So you got 36 people executed and 150 approximately imprisoned. And I mean, I don't want to do anything that would make anyone think I am diminishing or minimizing the horror and the impact of that, not just on the people involved, but on all the implications of it for everyone around. But we're talking about 36 deaths, not millions, not hundreds of thousands, not even hundreds. It's 36. So it was not a genocide, and that word has been used. So that's the Salem witch trials. The numbers were relatively small, but they're also relatively small to the European witch executions. And here I'm relying not just on Stark, but on a scholar named Brian Pavlak, professor of history, who's written a book on the subject and has a website. Pavlak is spelled Pavlac. So, how many in the European witch executions? And he says the best estimates of recent historians range from 50 to 200,000. Wow, now we're talking some pretty big numbers. But he compares it to the earlier estimates. He says, the 9 to 10 million numbers, gross exaggerations. No respectable historian supports them anymore. And for the reasons that we've mentioned before, that there are documents available now that have been released in the 20th century that weren't available before. And so people could get more accurate information. So
Now
there's a much
you said 50
go
to
ahead.
200,000?
Between 50 to 200,000 is what Pavlak says.
So 50,000 or 50?
50,000, excuse me.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
Because that was a big range there.
Yeah. Yeah. From 1 to 200,000. No. And I've heard some say 40,000 as the lower range. His 200,000 number is the highest range I've seen. Most people, the vast majority, say either 50 or 60. That's the most common number that's brought up. But he's being quite liberal here, I guess, in terms of what the possibilities are. And he says, I don't want to minimize the impact of this number of lives lost, but we're talking about a much smaller number over a long period of time, 3.5 to 4 centuries we're talking here. Now, Stark says competent scholars recently have assembled the evidence nation by nation and found the so-called accepted totals of the past utterly ridiculous. It's in England, for example. It was assumed in England that from 1600 to 1680, about 42,000 witches were burnt. But the most trustworthy figure, he says, it turns out to be fewer than 1,000 over a period of 3 centuries. In a similar fashion, here's his statement for all of Europe. The death toll, not 9 million, but about 60,000. And he emphasizes again, that is a tragic total. So I just want to clear that up off the top. We're not talking about millions, but we are talking about tens of thousands in England, and that is serious. And so what's the history, right? Like, how did all this happen? And it's quite interesting because Pavlak points out, and Stark says something similar, that during the Middle Ages, what people used to call the Dark Ages, and we've talked about this before, that they really weren't all that dark. There was much growth and positive impact on culture that was coming out during that time, and much growth during that time. But during the what we'll now call the Middle Ages, the predominant Christian view of witchcraft was that it was an illusion. So the Enlightenment story that the witchcraft was part of the whole Dark Ages and that whole mess, that's also mistaken. Not just the numbers, but the period that they put it in. The Christian view is that witchcraft was an illusion. People might think they were witches, but they're fooling themselves. Or maybe the devil was fooling them. I mean, people still did believe in the existence of the devil, but most Christian authorities thought that witchcraft could do no serious harm because it wasn't real. Now, Stark says, but they were involved in magic. Magic was part of the culture. People were practicing magic, and there was church magic and non-church magic. Part of this leans on the fact that the way the church dealt with the pagan culture over time was, at one point it was persecuted by the pagans. At another time, the Christians turned it around and they persecuted the pagans, but eventually they settled down and realized that wasn't the best way to go, and assimilation was the strategy of the church. And so sort of a syncretism developed, and you had church magic and non-church magic, which weren't always easy to separate. So church magic, you had sacred wells, springs, groves, shrines, where supplicants could seek all sorts of miracles and blessings. And by the way, I can't help but think of some things going on even in our day and age that I wonder about. A lot of homeopathic stuff. I don't know. Some of my friends swear by them, I'm skeptical. Some of that stuff, some of the snake oil salesmen of a couple of centuries ago, I wonder, I think it's that kind of thing that's going on, and distinguishing between what is true and what is not true isn't all that easy. But priests would get involved. They had an extensive array of incantations, prayers, and rites for dealing with real human concerns. Illness, number one thing. Or some priests were specialized in exorcism. That's still the case to this day. So parallel to this elaborate church magic system was an extensive culture of folk or traditional magic. And most of it was devoted to treating medical problems. Some of it predated Christianity, and some of it was just a jumbled adaptation of the church magic. So you got the two things going on. They're denying that there's really such thing as witchcraft, but you've got magic going on. And then comes what we talked about in the very first session we had, the Christian emphasis on reason, the Christian commitment to reason. Christianity is a theological religion. Stark makes a big deal about this. He thinks this is the number one thing that sets Christianity apart. It's Christianity is not satisfied with mystery meditation, but relentlessly seeks to ground its entire system of beliefs in logic and reason. Now, a lot of people wouldn't think that's true about Christianity today. Christianity is attacked for being, just a belief without evidence or blind faith and that sort of thing. But
and
that isn't
anti-science.
accurate. And anti-science, yeah. But that just isn't the accurate history of the church. So, but Stark says this admirable use of reason actually ends up being problematic when it comes to this issue. So, for the ancient Romans and Greeks, they devoted little time or effort explaining why magic works, because magic does seem to work at least some of the time. I mean, I've got friends that sell patches for pain that's supposed to do really good. I mean, any sort of remedy you got, you got the placebo effect, it's going to work some of the time, if for no other reason but that. And so the Greeks didn't, and Romans didn't bother even trying to explain that. But Christian thinkers want to know why. Why did the magic work, or at least seem to work?
Now, can I interrupt for a second,
right
Michael?
ahead. Yeah.
When I think of the words magic, I'm thinking beyond just putting a bunch of ingredients together and coming up with a formula. I'm thinking a call to the spirit realm in some way. Am I overstepping there, or is it?
Well, you're bringing up
mix?
Exactly the right issue. That's exactly the distinction that we need to make here. And we're going to see that the church does make that distinction. The best history we have is that the pagan magic that was being done in the early church time had nothing to do with Satan or calling upon demons, at least not knowingly. And so, and it can't be if the church considered magic, if there was church magic, right? But remember now, the church believes in the supernatural, and the Catholic Church not only believed in God, but in Mary and her ability to influence the world as well as God, and various saints and angels who may be active agents. And so when church magic was working, it kind of made sense that there was an explanation for it. There was this supernatural agents, or these supernatural agents, who were deciding whether or not to let it work or make it work. But what do you do then about the non-church magic that seems to work? It's certainly not going to be any of these church figures that would have allowed that to happen. Therefore, you're only left with some evil spirits, evil supernatural agents, and especially then Satan. So eventually, the church developed this thinking that Satan was the power behind non-church magic that was working, and hence to practice non-church magic constituted invoking Satan and his demons, and that is the definition of witchcraft. So you were right. You were thinking of witchcraft, but there is this distinction that there can be a magic maybe that doesn't involve witchcraft. But the two came together as we moved into the 13th century or so. So it's as we're out of the Dark Ages and beginning in the Renaissance is when this happened, not during the Dark Ages. So it was a short step to deduce that thousands of the wise ones, so that was the term given to practitioners of magic, were involved in satanic dealings, and the witch hunts were born. So this is what would be weird.
Okay, just for clarification purposes here, what would be symptoms of a witch under this definition? Because I can think of, for example, I have a book of medicinal plants, for example, that are, if you take this plant and boil it and whatever, it acts as a topical, anesthetic or whatever. Would that be included? People, let's say herbalists, people who found out that there were certain plants that were medicinal and they mixed those together, would they be classified as, because it's not really church activities here, we're just making some medicine.
Yeah,
or
the
plants.
dividing line there between that, I'm not entirely sure, because I mean, no doubt there was the use of herbs and plant life to try to cure illnesses or symptoms of illnesses. Um, at what point it was called witchcraft, I'm afraid I didn't come across anything that answered that question. Um, and so the best I can say is that towards the middle of the 15th century, Pope 1484, Pope Innocent the Eighth produced a message that they call these papal bulls, bull, and it was called Summus Desiderantes, Desiderantes, and this allowed the Inquisition, which we talked about last time, to pursue witches. So that's quite late, 1484, that happened. So that changed the culture. Up to that point, the church just didn't think that witches existed, and now you've got the Inquisition being allowed to pursue witches.
But we don't have any knowledge of why all of a sudden this happened. Like, there some people killed or something because of these witches? Like, what forced this to hit the Pope and his people? Like,
Well, for that papal bull to be given, it was just the gradual theological teaching that Satan had to be the cause of non-church magic. Once that decision was made by the theologians within the church, then that spreads. I mean, those sort of ideas, even nowadays, it takes a generation or two, and probably more back then, to what's done in the academic world to work its way down to the man on the street, so to speak. But as that fact spread, then, I mean, I can imagine the thoughts of, well, my neighbor there just got his big toe healed, and it wasn't the priest that did that. It wasn't church magic. And so, it's just human nature being what it can be, being paranoid, being afraid, maybe being mad at your neighbor. I mean, this is what happens later on. This is ways of settling scores. You can just accuse your neighbor of these things. They're going to get in trouble. I mean, these things are happening today, and we don't call them magic and witchcraft, but the type of actions that humans take against other human beings, of accusing each other and canceling each other and trying to cause harm to each other, happens. And I think it was as simple as that. But then a clear major thing happened called the Reformation. So we're talking about 25 years, 30 years after the papal bull. And the church breaks apart, and the Roman Catholicism sort of begins to redefine itself under very strict papal authority called the magisterium. These are the people that are going to decide what is true and what isn't true, and it's all under the authority of the Pope. But then you've got Lutheranism and Calvinism and Anglicanism, and they asserted other sources for divine authority. And the surprising part is the Protestant reformers most often agreed with Rome, the current Rome that we're talking about in this time period here, that witches were a clear and present danger. And so all four churches, Roman Catholic, Lutheran, Calvinist, Anglican, persecuted witches to some degree or another. The Eastern Christian or Orthodox Christians did not seem to do it virtually at all. Now, the next thing that comes in here is that the authority for carrying out sentences against people was transferred from the church to the secular authorities around this time as well.
I've heard that before.
So none of these persecutions could have been carried on without the permission or cooperation of the secular governments.
Now, was that the secular government trying to tell the church to back off? This is our job, or is that the church trying to say, we don't want, like, sort of, we want to wipe our hands of this. Let's make the courts do it.
No, I don't think it was just about witches. I think it was a broader issue in the culture. I mean, the whole history of the church and trying to sort out it, who's in charge of who is a long history, and this was just part of that process, I think.
One of the things that when you say probably wasn't a secular government as far as what we might think of today as secular government, but I think one of the things we're assuming here, let's say if we're going to accuse Christians of killing witches, what was the state of Christianity at the time? Because we didn't really have, like, say if the church was saying, the Roman Catholic Church was saying the magisterium are the people who can properly understand and they're to teach, they're the enlightened ones. There might be discouraging people. In fact, you didn't have printing presses up until near that time.
Just about that time, yeah.
Yeah. So what was the condition of the average person walking down the street who would say they were a Christian and who might be? Is it really these people, or is it the church authorities who are launching these investigations on witches, or is it the common person that does the accusing, and then the church authorities coupled with a government that do the judgment?
It's all three of those. It's the common people that are doing the accusing, carrying out the magic. It's the church authorities who are involved in heresy hunting, and the witchcraft thing got included in that. And then now it's the secular governments, and you're right, it's not secular in the sense that we think of it, but it's the princes, the monarchs, the ruling governors, so to speak, who had the power of policing and executing that took over. So it's a combination of all three of those things happening, and that's why it's really hard to see there's just one cause. It's a whole bunch of things happening at once and kind of coming together.
And I can see this just being so corrupted that, like, I could see the totally non-Christian person that just wants to take out somebody that's even a business competitor. It's like, oh, well, just accuse them of being a witch.
Sure. And actually, back to answering the first part of your question, Kirk, the state of Christianity then was described actually by Martin Luther. I just read this recently, and I was just shocked how Luther described the typical Sunday service. It was not well populated, and many who came late or left when the sermon started. And while they were there, they were either sleeping or burping or farting. I mean, it was nothing like what we're expecting. It wasn't like they were sitting in these beautiful cathedrals with Gregorian chants happening around them, and it was all beautiful, majestic worship of God. It was the peasants in the local church, and with pastors on the Protestant side, priests on the Catholic side, who may not be all that well educated in some cases. And so the discipleship happening among the Christian church, I think, was very minimal, except for those that actually, were on the path to become clergy, and then they had very good education, but the gap was just huge. And so you don't have theologically astute people here, and you don't have people, I don't think, whose lives have been transformed very much by the Spirit of God at all. Yeah.
One of the things that I have often noticed, and I just see it again today in somebody's tweet, the culture today tends to see and talk about Christians as one monolithic entity. And here's what the Christians do, and here's what they have done. But in reality, it's just a massive spectrum from one extreme to the next. And like it reminds me of something Jesus said, that there'll be many on the last days when they stand before God who say, Lord, didn't we do this and that? And, religious activities. And he'll say, I never knew you, you who practice lawlessness. And so I think one of the take homes here is that we have to be extremely careful, and our culture needs to be called on treating Christianity as a monolithic thing when they don't understand what authentic Christianity is. And authentic Christianity would be basically defined by Christ, as opposed to everything else that people do who would maybe self-identify as Christian because, in the 1600s, what else was there in Europe? I mean, of course I was a Christian, so to speak, but what I did during the week is, wow, it would be hard pressed. I would, it's not up to me to decide who's a Christian and who's not. But Jesus did say you will know them by their fruit. And it doesn't sound there was a lot of fruit here in the general population.
Yeah, not as much as we would hope. And that didn't change much even up into the 18th and 19th century. I read descriptions of what church life was like even then. And it wasn't much different than what Luther described in the 16th century. That's why there was such a need for revivals, even a couple hundred years after the Reformation, and
I've been to a lot of churches in my life, and there's been a few that I would say are very similar to what Martin was describing there. Maybe not as blatantly gross, but there's a lot of sleepy town churches.
Well, we won't talk about what we won't talk about falling asleep in church.
Yeah, I don't want to really point too many fingers here, because one of the things I've wrestled with in this study is recognizing that even though what you said is true, Kirk, that there's authentic Christianity and a whole lot of people who call themselves Christians maybe aren't very authentic, but there is no doubt in all these bad things that Christians have done, we were looking at, that some real Christians have done them. And the point that we've made in the past is that yes, real Christians have done them, but when they do, they are following their own sinful natures or very often the culture that they happen to be in, rather than the teaching of the scripture. And we're going to get to that. That's the bottom line in this thing too. We're going to ask that question and try to answer it. Is the teaching of Christianity the cause of the witch craze? And we'll answer that in a few minutes.
That's a very important point, Michael. Because I see a lot of stuff going on today by people who would identify as Christians, but what they're actually promoting is just basically following the culture. And perhaps the same questions will be raised if humanity survives in 200, 300 years' time, and say, wow, like what were the Christians thinking if they endorsed this or that? And it's basically following the culture rather than following the teachings of Christ.
So one other point throw in here, and the last point I made and this one, I think, are both going to be part of a larger theme in the very last session we have together, which is the next one whenever that we have that. And that is that it seems like all things, including all good things, over time get twisted. All good things related to human beings that involve human beings get twisted. And I think it's really clear to see that now in our culture, and how a lot of it is related back to the beginning of the Enlightenment and some of these exaggerations that we talked about. But let me just make this point to transition here. The secular authorities, that is the princes, they hunted witches because church leaders taught them that witches were disturbers of the peace, destructors of property, and killers of animal and people. So we think back to C.S. Lewis's quote at the beginning here. I mean, if we really thought people were doing those things, we'd be for prosecuting them too. Whether we would, I mean, our cultures have been strongly influenced with an anti-capital punishment sense. So we might think they shouldn't be killed, but we might think they should be put away for a long time. But they shouldn't be ignored.
Well, one of the problems was that the witches could wreak their havoc from a prison cell as well, and that was one of the issues, that they weren't necessarily rendered powerless by simply putting them in a jail somewhere.
That's correct. That's a good point. That's why it's execution rather than just in being in jail. Yeah. So even, I mean, as efforts came to sort of expose the witchcraft that was allegedly going on and suppress the evil in the non-church magic, it actually led to panic. It just as people talked about it more, as it became a public topic of conversation, people began to panic. I mean, we've seen similar things in our day and age too, right? And so all the lurid tales get exaggerated and they spread rapidly. And where the governance was weak, where you didn't have a solid police presence, so to speak, then the mobs and local authorities who had some power get swept up in the craze. An interesting point, though, that we're going to move into here is that, like, one of the exaggerated claims is that it's the Inquisition that were behind the majority of the witch killings, and they burned people at the stake. And that actually is not the case. The Inquisitors were not the major proponents, and they did not actually kill the majority of the people, because they were connected with a 12th century church academic area that had developed based on Paul's teaching of there's neither Jew nor Greek, and all are made in the image of God. And they began to start talking about human rights back then. And so they began to treat, I mean, just the beginnings, began to treat people more sympathetically and see everyone is made in the image of God. And it was just beginning, but it was enough to make the Catholic Inquisition stand out from the Protestant people who were promoting the witch killings. That's a little bit different. And because there was a formal authority structure in the Catholic Church that could be a channel for this teaching to kind of work its way down among the authorities. And there really wasn't one yet within Protestantism. It was still sort of every man for himself in certain ways, like the Wild West, I guess. So consequently, the Spanish Inquisition, which is the most notorious of them, in history anyway, sent virtually no witches to the stake. And those that were convicted, it was after they'd been convicted for the third or fourth time.
Now, what did these trials look like? Was it actually a trial, or was it like my little thing, drowning means innocence? Are they literally bounding them up and putting them in the lake and seeing if they float?
Yeah, it was stuff like that when you look at the entire continent of Europe. History shows that those involved in the Inquisition, though, did have this teaching that they were trying to enforce, and they were trying to do things that would be more in line with what we would consider a proper trial to look like, in questioning witnesses and assuming people were innocent until proven guilty, and making sure that there was enough evidence to actually substantiate the claims. And this wasn't happening all the time outside of the Inquisition people, and it wasn't happening all the time with the Inquisitors either, because it was just the beginnings of this. But the only point I want to make here is that there does seem to be really good evidence that those who were behind the Inquisition actually laid the foundation, the groundwork, and began practicing the practices that put an end to the witch craze about 100 years before it ended. And people will claim, well, no, it's the Enlightenment people that did that. No, it's not. 100 years before any Enlightenment people were involved in trying to get rid of the witch craze, to curtail it, they were actively involved in it. And I've got lots of evidence of that. So the Inquisition played a major role in actually ending the witch hunts, is the one point that I want to make here. So the second point,
does your research say why? Like, what was it? Was it just the reason side of things, or did they see, just this one area of what we're doing is, we've crossed a line here?
Well, I think it was because you had an authority structure where there's some sort of control that was lacking on the Protestant side. And that authority structure had been influenced by some really good teaching on human rights that the scholars had come up with in the 12th century. That was beginning to spread and move its way through. And eventually,
so, is it the Inquisitors? Are the Inquisitors like saying, you know what we're doing over here is okay, but this witch thing, that's a line we're not crossing? Or is it the whole thing is sort of falling through this?
It wasn't that black and white. It wasn't that they completely disagreed with witches being tried or even killed, but far fewer of them were convicted and killed. And they had more fair trials given to them. I'm trying to find a couple of quick quotes here to show you this, but there's ones by Salazar, the Spanish Inquisition, where he basically, after he heard that there were 6 witches burned at the stake, which did happen, that he went there and took over, and he actually ended up putting all the people that killed the witches on trial, because they had not done it properly. They had been unfair, and there were other factors going on that were just immoral as well as illegal. And so they, and in some cases, he just said, there's nothing going on here. There's no witches. It's just hysteria. It's just, and he even says, and we shouldn't even speak about it, because speaking about it makes the rumors run rampant, and then more people get accused. So it's those types of responses to seeing what was happening. They were seeing what we now see later on, that something crazy was going on here. They saw it early, and curtailed it to a certain degree, even though they still believed that non-church magic could only be caused by Satan. They were just more careful on how the accused were treated.
So it seems like the church had this idea that, as you said, non-church magic has to have its source in Satan. But then the general population sort of took this and ran with it, and things got out of control.
Right.
And then the church, wanting to take a rational, a justice approach, and it's a rational thinking approach,
right,
actually reined this in and curtailed it. So you can see that the popular urban myth that Christianity only has a bad influence here in this whole thing, that really doesn't stand at all. It's much more complex than that.
It is more complex. I mean, still, real Christians did kill people unjustly sometimes, and they burned people that should have been burned sometimes, but not in the numbers that we think. And it wasn't the Catholic Inquisition that was the majority behind it. And then eventually, the influence of what the Inquisitors were doing spread to the Protestants and the Enlightenment thinkers. And about 100 years later, the witch craze came to an end as they began to apply the principles of human rights. And so this gets us to the causes. Now, I'm just going to give you a brief couple of statements here, because there's just no way we can go into it all. But there's about 10 or 11 common causes. I'm just going to kind of listen to this, get an idea what they might be. Mass hysteria theory, delusion theory, geographic origins theories. Certain geographic areas, for some reason, were applicable. Disaster theory, wherever there was plague or famine, that's where it happened. The greed theory, it was done to confiscate property. The mistaken conspiracy theory, that the pagan magic perpetrators were connected to a satanic cult, almost like almost an organization type of thing. Actual satanic religious rebellion is another theory. Different denominations in conflict with each other. So, Protestants burning Catholics and Catholics burning Protestants. There's a couple of others. Misogyny theory, that everyone was out to get women. Religious competition theory. If you can show yourself tough on witches, you'll get more people coming to your denomination. But none of these by themselves can explain what happened. And Pavlich goes through all those and shows how none of them are adequate to explain it. Maybe some combination of those 10 or 11 might explain it somewhat, but no one really has the answer to that. And so that leads us to the only thing we got time for right now is the key question. Was biblical teaching the cause? Would that explain it? Well, the first thing to note is that is not listed in anybody's writings, that biblical teaching was the cause. Now, people will say Christians were the cause. Christian authorities were the cause, but nobody is claiming that biblical teaching was the cause. Nobody was appealing to Scripture, even though there are Old Testament texts that say sorcerers should be killed, and New Testament portions that say they are part of the list of people that will not inherit the kingdom of heaven. So we can imagine that could have influenced the witch craze, but there's no evidence that they did. So what was happening then was that practice of magic that I told you about. And then what I think is this: poor application of the Bible's teaching on the imago Dei, that is the image of God in each person. Poor application of the Bible's teachings on loving your neighbor and loving your enemies. Poor application of the Bible's teachings on the fallenness of all human beings and our propensity to lie and covet and steal, do what's best for ourselves even when it hurts others. Poor understanding of the process of testimony and even discerning whether people are telling the truth or versus lies. Poor recognition of other factors that may have contributed to people telling lies and accusing others falsely. Wild accusations by children being too readily accepted by adults. Treating people as outsiders too much. Jurors related to the accusers. Christians following just their sinful natures and the cultural teaching of suspicion of and power over the other. And so the problem isn't belief in the supernatural. See, that's the Enlightenment story. It's belief in the supernatural that was the problem here. And in particular, evil supernatural beings. The problem is in the reasoning and the paranoia that led to the hysteria, false accusations, and then the abandonment of love, charity, grace, careful reasoning, and careful checks and balances in the trial procedure.
So We could sum it up by saying the problem wasn't the application of Christianity in producing a lot of witch killings. The problem was in the lack of application of the teachings of Christ, which allowed
Correct.
the witch persecutions to flourish and proliferate.
Exactly.
I'm also seeing something very similar to what's going on right now with a lot of what's like the trans stuff in the States around public schools and different things, how it has blown up into this massive cultural event where you have one group, one tribe on one side and one tribe on the
Right.
other. And I think both are exaggerating it. Both are making it the biggest thing in the world that could possibly exist. And the on the Christian side that I'm seeing a lot of is there's a fear that if we don't solve this problem, the world is going to go really downhill really fast. And therefore we need to break it, shut it down, destroy it. And on the other side, it's, well, we want to do what we want to do. But the Christians don't seem to recognize the aspect where God is actually in control. And so there's one part of it is, yeah, as Christians we have lines that we need to follow. But there's also the fear of we need to politically solve this, and it's politics that are going to solve it, or it's man's ways of doing things that are going to solve the problem rather than a spiritual side.
Well, you brought up some really interesting stuff that will actually be part of the next session, because I'm going to ask the question, how should Christians engage with our world right now? And that is a perfect example that you gave. I'm more inclined to think we do need to do something. Just saying that God's in control doesn't mean we don't do anything.
It's
Just
the
like
fear
when
part.
when I've got cancer, God's in control, but that doesn't mean I don't get radiation or take chemotherapy. And so there may be a case, I think there is a case for Christians to be involved. It's how we do it.
Right.
That is the real difficult question. And the history of Christianity is when we use force and violence, well, first of all, it's not following the example of Jesus. And when we do, it leads to bad results.
Mhm.
But some people think that persuasion is force. And I don't think it is. Persuasion is persuasion done in love, I think, is the right move. And we do need to persuade people that if there are ideas that are taking place in our culture, in their application, and they're causing a great deal of harm, we need to be an advocate for those that are being harmed,
Mhm.
whether they know it or not, and definitely for those that know it and no one's speaking up for them. And we need to give an alternative, persuasive reason why there are better ideas around. But that's getting into the next session, because we still haven't totally finished this one. So let me see. How can I just tie this together here? So I think, Kirk, I think you already mentioned that if, in fact, some of these Christian principles had been applied properly, they would have prevented the witch executions, like a careful reasoning process designed to get at the truth of the matter, which is what the Inquisitors were doing a little bit more than the Protestants were. And a process that also protects the human rights of both the accused and the accuser, acknowledges the image of God in everybody, plus the human fallenness of everybody, and innocent till proven guilty. If those things had been applied, and those all have biblical basis, then maybe there would never have been a witch craze, but there was, unfortunately. So I'm going to move right to this last point, and it'll function as a transition piece to the next one as well. So, I mean, I'm admitting that real Christians, have done bad things, and here's another example of it. But when given the opportunity, irreligious people have done no better. And this is not an attempt to say, well, what about, what aboutism? This is an attempt to set the record straight. And there's no better example of this than the French Revolution. If you compare the record of the Inquisition with the death toll of the French Revolution, I mean, there's just no comparison. You've even got the London Times writing newspaper articles while the French Revolution is going on, just across the English Channel there, just talking about how horrible things are. The Times of London wrote, "Are these the rights of man?" See, that was one of the catchwords, the rights of man in the French Revolution. Is this the liberty of human nature? And they were just talking about thousands of women and men just being dragged to death and put to death in the Reign of Terror, and guillotined. Public drowning of 2,000 men and women in a river, being called Republic baptisms. And so in just 9 months, the newly enlightened revolutionaries of the Enlightenment executed 3 times as many people as the Spanish Inquisition had killed it over 300 years. So in 9 months, compared to 300 years, the French revolutionaries executed 3 times as many people as the entire Spanish Inquisition. And these were all Enlightenment rationalists, insisting that what they were doing was virtuous.
Are you going to go into this further on our next session, Michael? Because this is not a one-off example that you give.
No, it's not.
Basically a sincere faith in God actually acts as some form of restraint from just complete unleashing of human nature and hatred and killing. But when we see that factored out, the belief and the restraint that God offers, we see something like what you just described for the French Revolution. But if we're going to dive into this next week or next time, then we'll save it till then.
Right. So let me just finish by just saying this. This is not an attempt to say, see, Christians aren't so bad. In fact, you guys are worse. You atheists are worse, or something like that. Not at all. This whole thing points to a deeper issue. There's something else going on here that is the cause, and it's about human nature, and that's what we're going to end talking about next time.
Awesome. All right. Well, those of you who are listening now or later, don't forget to hit the bell, hit the like, and hit the subscribe, just so that you get notified of coming up stuff. Leave an emoticon or something in the chat or the comments to give some engagement to this, and so more people can see it later. And don't forget, if you want to talk to us, you can leave a comment in the comments after, or go to kirkdurston.com. And you can leave a private comment there, and Kirk will get to that. I think, Kirk, we're going to have to go through the mailbag soon and dig up some comments and do a stream on things people have been sending in, because there's been some fun stuff that has
there's a lot.
Good conversations. And so I think we'll get into that as well. And we'll see you again, Michael, soon. I don't know when our next one is, Kirk. When do you get back?
Let's see. It could possibly happen next week.
You'll be jet lagged.
Well,
You'll still be in Hawaii.
It won't be 2 weeks from. Let's see. We'll have to get back.
All right. We'll put something out. That's why you need to hit that bell so you get notified when we have it coming upstream. All right. Good talking to you guys. Hope you have a good night. Sorry to all you Leaf fans out there, but playoffs are here, and that's not good for you. So bye, everybody. Talk to you later.
Bye for now.